The screaming started at exactly 3:17 p.m. on what should have been a peaceful Tuesday afternoon in Riverside Meadows, the kind of upscale subdivision where perfectly manicured lawns competed for neighborhood supremacy and HOA violations were handed out like parking tickets in downtown Manhattan. Marcus Chen had been enjoying his first day off in 3 weeks, finally catching up on yard work, while his 2 young daughters played in their backyard sandbox. As a Coast Guard lieutenant commander stationed at the nearby Rescue Coordination Center, he rarely had time for domestic tranquility. The irony of what was about to unfold wouldn't hit him until much later. The peace shattered when Brenda Hoffmeister, known throughout the neighborhood simply as HOA Karen, came storming across 3 pristine lawns like a woman possessed, her perfectly styled blonde bob bouncing with each indignant step. At 52, Brenda had appointed herself the unofficial sheriff of Riverside Meadows, wielding her HOA board position like a medieval weapon against anyone who dared violate her interpretation of community standards. Excuse me, she bellowed, her voice carrying the kind of authority typically reserved for air traffic controllers. What exactly do you think you're doing? Marcus looked up from where he was trimming hedges near the community retention pond that bordered his property. The pond served as both a scenic feature and crucial flood control system for their low-lying neighborhood, designed to collect runoff during the frequent Florida thunderstorms that turned streets into temporary rivers. Just some yard work, Marcus replied calmly, setting down his hedge trimmers. His Coast Guard training had taught him to assess situations quickly, and something about Brenda's aggressive posture suggested this wasn't going to be a friendly neighborly chat. That's not yard work, that's environmental destruction. Brenda jabbed her finger toward the pond's edge where Marcus had been clearing overgrown vegetation. You're disturbing the natural habitat and violating Section 12.4 of our community guidelines regarding waterfront maintenance. Marcus blinked slowly. He'd lived in the neighborhood for 2 years and had never heard of Section 12.4. More importantly, he'd been clearing invasive Brazilian pepper plants that were actually choking out native species, something he'd learned during his environmental compliance training with the Coast Guard. Ma'am, I'm actually removing invasive plants that don't ma'am me. Brenda's voice pitched higher, causing several neighbors to emerge from their houses like prairie dogs sensing danger. I've been monitoring your property for weeks and I'm documenting multiple violations. Unauthorized vegetation removal, improper waste disposal, and now you're probably contaminating our water system. What Brenda didn't know, what she couldn't have known because she'd never bothered to introduce herself properly, was that Marcus wasn't just any neighbor. His day job involved coordinating search and rescue operations across 3 states, managing emergency responses during hurricanes, and yes, dealing with flood control systems. The retention pond she was so vehemently defending, he'd actually filed several reports with the county about drainage issues that needed addressing. Look, I understand your concern, Marcus said, his voice maintaining the steady calm that had talked panicked boaters through Category 4 storms. But there are some drainage problems with this pond that actually pose a flooding risk to the entire neighborhood. I was planning to bring it up at the next HOA meeting. Brenda's eyes narrowed to slits. Flooding risk? The only risk here is your unauthorized interference with community property. She pulled out her phone and began taking photos of Marcus, the pond, and the pile of invasive plants he'd removed. I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting, and I'm reporting you to the county for environmental violations. That's when the first drops of rain began to fall. The Florida sky transformed from azure blue to ominous charcoal in the span of 15 minutes, as if someone had pulled a blackout curtain across the heavens. Marcus glanced up at the rapidly darkening clouds, his meteorological training kicking in automatically. Wind speed increasing, pressure dropping, the telltale signs of a serious storm system moving in fast. We should probably head inside, he called to his daughters, who were still building sandcastles, blissfully unaware of the brewing tempest. Looks like we're getting some weather. But Brenda was just getting started. The light drizzle seemed to energize her righteous fury rather than dampen it. She marched toward the retention pond's control structure, a concrete housing that contained the Floodgate system designed to regulate water levels during heavy rainfall. Since you want to play environmental expert, she announced loudly enough for the growing audience of concerned neighbors to hear, let me show you what proper water management looks like. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he watched Brenda approach the manual override wheel on the Floodgate. Wait, don't touch that. I've lived here for 8 years. Brenda shouted over the increasing wind. I know exactly how this system works. The pond is supposed to maintain a specific water level, not drain out because some military boy thinks he knows better than the engineers who designed it. The rain was coming down steadier now, fat droplets that splattered against the concrete and sent ripples across the pond's surface. Marcus could see the water level already beginning to rise as storm drains throughout the neighborhood began feeding their runoff into the retention system. Ma'am, please step away from that gate, Marcus said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used during emergency broadcasts. That system is designed to release water gradually during storms, if you close it completely. Don't tell me what to do on community property. Brenda grabbed the wheel with both hands and began cranking it clockwise, her face red with exertion and indignation. This is exactly the kind of unauthorized interference I've been talking about. The floodgate groaned as it slowly sealed shut, cutting off the pond's primary drainage outlet. Several neighbors had gathered now, drawn by the commotion and the rapidly deteriorating weather. The Johnsons from next door, elderly Mrs. Patterson with her umbrella, the new family with twin toddlers whose names Marcus hadn't learned yet. "Brenda, honey, maybe we should listen to him," suggested Carol Johnson nervously. "He seems to know about this stuff. He's military, not a civil engineer." Brenda snapped, giving the wheel one final aggressive turn. The gate sealed with a definitive clunk that made Marcus's chest tighten with dread. There. Now the water level will stay where it's supposed to be instead of draining out because of his meddling. Marcus pulled out his phone and quickly opened his weather app. The radar image made his blood run cold. A massive storm cell, bright red and orange on the display, moving directly toward their area with wind speeds approaching 60 miles per hour. The National Weather Service had just issued a flash flood warning for their county. "Brenda, you need to open that gate right now," he said, his voice cutting through the increasing wind and rain. "We've got a major storm system incoming, and this pond needs to drain or the entire neighborhood is going to flood." "I'm not opening anything." She crossed her arms defiantly, rain streaming down her face. "You've already done enough damage with your unauthorized landscaping project." That's when Marcus heard it, the sound every Coast Guard officer dreaded. The low rumble of massive amounts of water moving fast, combined with a distinctive whistle of wind through tight spaces. He looked up to see what could only be described as a wall of rain advancing toward them like a gray curtain being drawn across the landscape. "Everyone needs to get to higher ground now," Marcus shouted, his emergency training overriding any attempt at diplomacy. "This is not a drill." The wall of water hit 30 seconds later. Rain fell in sheets so thick it was like standing under a waterfall, instantly soaking everyone to the skin and reducing visibility to mere feet. The retention pond, with its drainage gate firmly sealed shut, began rising at an alarming rate. Within 2 minutes, what had been a peaceful neighborhood amenity transformed into a rapidly expanding lake. Water poured in from storm drains throughout the subdivision, each gallon adding to the growing crisis that Brenda's stubbornness had just made exponentially worse. Marcus watched in horror as the water level rose past the pond's design capacity, spilling over the carefully landscaped banks and beginning its inexorable march toward the houses. His house. The Johnsons' house. Everyone's house. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, water streaming off the screen as he dialed a number he'd hoped never to use from his own neighborhood. "Coast Guard Emergency Response, this is Lieutenant Commander Chen, badge number 7749. I need immediate deployment of rescue assets to Riverside Meadows subdivision. We had a flash flood situation in progress with multiple civilians at risk." Brenda, standing waist-deep in what used to be her perfectly manicured community pond, finally stopped shouting about HOA violations. The transformation from suburban paradise to disaster zone happened with breathtaking speed. Within 10 minutes of Marcus' emergency call, the retention pond had become a sprawling lake that stretched across what used to be 3 backyards. The water, dark with runoff and debris, lapped hungrily at the foundations of million-dollar homes. Oh God, what have I done?" Brenda gasped, struggling to wade through the rising water toward higher ground. Her perfectly styled hair hung in wet strings around her face, and her designer HOA meeting outfit clung to her like a soggy second skin. This wasn't supposed to happen. Marcus had no time for her belated realization. He'd already moved his daughters to the second floor of their house and was now coordinating evacuation efforts with the calm efficiency that had earned him commendations during hurricane season 2023. "Mrs. Patterson," he called to the elderly woman who was standing on her porch, clutching her walker and staring in shock at the water that was now lapping at her front steps. "You need to get to your upstairs bedroom right now." "I don't have upstairs," she called back, her voice trembling with panic. "This is a ranch house." Marcus felt his heart sink. Mrs. Patterson's house, along with several others in the subdivision, sat on the lowest part of the development. The architect's clever design that put premium lots closer to the water feature had just become a death trap. His phone buzzed with an incoming call. "Chen here." "Marcus, this is Captain Rodriguez at District 7. We got your location flagged and we're deploying assets now. What's your situation assessment?" Marcus looked around at the rapidly deteriorating scene. The Johnsons were on their roof, having climbed out through an upstairs window. The new family with twins was trapped on their second-floor balcony, the father holding both children, while his wife waved frantically for help. Water was now 3 feet deep in the street and rising fast. Multiple civilians stranded, water rising approximately 6 inches every 10 minutes, Marcus reported, his professional training keeping his voice steady despite the chaos. "We've got elderly residents in single-story homes, families with small children on upper floors, and the drainage system is completely compromised due to." He glanced at Brenda, who was now clinging to a decorative lamppost. "Civilian interference with flood control infrastructure." "Copy that. We've got rescue boat Alpha 7 en route, ETA 12 minutes. Can you maintain scene coordination until arrival?" "Affirmative. I'll establish a collection point at the community center. It's on the highest ground in the subdivision." Marcus pocketed his phone and cupped his hands around his mouth. "Attention, ARIA's ID and sits. If you can safely evacuate on foot, move to the community center parking lot. If you're trapped, stay where you are and wait for rescue boats." But even as he shouted instructions, Marcus could see the situation deteriorating by the minute. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the sealed floodgate meant that every drop of rain falling across the entire watershed was backing up into their neighborhood like water in a clogged bathtub. "You have to fix this." Brenda splashed toward him desperately, water now up to her chest. "You know about this stuff. Open the gate." Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "The gate mechanism is completely underwater now. Even if I could reach it, the pressure differential would make it impossible to turn by hand." "Then call someone. Call the city. Call the county." "I did call someone," Marcus said grimly, pointing toward the horizon where the distinctive orange hull of a Coast Guard rescue boat was beginning to appear through the rain. "But those people you were so worried about me contaminating the water system for, they're about to lose their homes because you wouldn't listen to someone who actually knows how flood control works." The sound of powerful marine engines cut through the storm as Coast Guard rescue boat Alpha 7 rounded the corner where Elm Street used to be, its hull cutting through water that was now deep enough to navigate. The sight of a Coast Guard vessel cruising down a suburban street would have been surreal under any other circumstances. Lieutenant Sarah Mills, the boat's commanding officer, expertly maneuvered the craft toward the stranded residents. "Commander Chen," she called over the engine noise, "where do you want us to start?" Marcus quickly assessed the scene with tactical precision. Mrs. Patterson first, elderly resident, medical needs, single-story home completely flooded, then the family with twins on the balcony. As the rescue boat moved toward Mrs. Patterson's house, now sitting like an island in the expanding flood zone, Marcus heard a sound that made his blood run cold. The groan of stressed metal and concrete, followed by a deep rumbling that seemed to come from underground. "What was that?" Brenda asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus looked toward the sealed floodgate, where the concrete housing was now completely submerged under 8 feet of backed-up stormwater. The sound came again, louder this time. "The infrastructure is failing," he said quietly. "The pressure buildup is more than the system was designed to handle." Brenda's face went white as the implications hit her. She'd done more than just flood the neighborhood. She potentially damaged the entire drainage system for hundreds of homes downstream. That's when the first house foundation cracked with an ominous splitting sound that could be heard even over the storm. The crack that split through Mrs. Patterson's foundation sounded like a gunshot echoing across the flooded subdivision. Marcus watched in horror as the elderly woman's ranch house visibly shifted, one corner sinking into the saturated ground as water poured through the new fissure in the concrete. "Alpha 7, emergency priority." Marcus barked into his radio. "Foundation failure at target location. We need immediate extraction." Lieutenant Middles didn't hesitate. The Coast Guard rescue boat surged forward through the debris-filled water, its powerful engines churning up weight that lapped against submerged mailboxes and street signs. Within minutes, the orange and white vessel was positioned alongside Mrs. Patterson's collapsing porch. "Ma'am, we're going to get you out of there," Mills called as 2 rescue swimmers prepared to enter the structure. "Just stay calm and do exactly what we tell you." But Mrs. Patterson's house wasn't the only structure showing signs of stress. The pressure from the backed-up floodwater was affecting the entire neighborhood's infrastructure. Storm drains that should have been carrying water away were instead fontaining geysers of murky water up through manholes, and several other houses were showing hairline cracks in their foundations. "How many people are we looking at for evacuation?" Mills asked Marcus over the radio. Marcus did a quick mental count of the families he could see stranded on roofs and balconies throughout the flooded area. Minimum 15 civilians, possibly more. The Johnson family is on their roof, the Hendersons are on their second-floor balcony with twin toddlers, and I can see at least 3 other families that are going to need water rescue. "Copy that. I've called for additional assets. We've got Alpha 12 en route from Station Clearwater, ETA 8 minutes. As if summoned by the radio call, the distinctive sound of rotor blades began cutting through the storm noise. A Coast Guard MH-65 Dolphin helicopter appeared through the rain clouds, its searchlight sweeping across the flooded neighborhood like a mechanical guardian angel. Air Station Miami, this is Rescue 6203, came the voice over Marcus's radio. We have eyes on multiple civilians requiring evacuation, requesting permission to begin hoist operations. Permission granted. Marcus responded, automatically slipping into his role as on-scene commander. Prioritize elderly and families with small children. We've got structural failures developing, so time is critical. Brenda, who had been silent for the past 10 minutes while clinging to her lamppost, finally found her voice again. This is insane. It's just a little flooding. Why are there helicopters? Why are there boats in our street? Marcus turned to look at her, water now to his shoulders as he stood in what used to be the community park. Because 15 minutes ago, you decided you knew better than someone whose job it is to prevent exactly this kind of disaster. The helicopter moved into position over the Henderson family's balcony, its rotor wash creating white caps on the floodwater below. Marcus watched with professional pride as the rescue swimmer was lowered on the hoist cable, moving with a practiced efficiency that made the Coast Guard legendary. First child secured, came the report over the radio. Hoisting now. One by one, the Henderson twins were lifted to safety, followed by their parents. The helicopter immediately moved to its next target, the Johnson family, who had been stranded on their roof for nearly 20 minutes. Meanwhile, Alpha 7 had successfully extracted Mrs. Patterson from her collapsing house and was now moving toward a family trapped in a two-story colonial whose first floor was completely submerged. The operation was textbook perfect, a kind of coordinated rescue response that Marcus had helped plan dozens of times but never expected to deploy in his own backyard. Commander Chen, Lieutenant Mills, called over the radio. We've got a problem. The Floodgate housing is showing stress fractures. If that thing fails completely, we're looking at a catastrophic drainage failure that could affect the entire watershed. Marcus felt his stomach drop. A complete failure of the drainage system wouldn't just flood Riverside Meadows, it would send a wall of water downstream toward 3 other subdivisions and the main highway interchange. Can we get a dive team to manually open the gate? He asked. Negative. Water pressure's too high and the visibility is 0. We need specialized equipment and a lot more time than we have. That's when Brenda, apparently overhearing the radio conversation, began to panic in earnest. Wait, what does that mean? What happens if it fails? Marcus looked at her with a mixture of frustration and pity. It means your 4-minute tantrum about HOA regulations is about to become a regional disaster affecting thousands of people. The second Coast Guard boat, Alpha 12, rounded the corner at that moment, its crew immediately moving to assist with the remaining evacuations. Between the 2 boats and the helicopter, they were making good progress extracting the stranded residents, but Marcus knew they were racing against time. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and every minute that passed meant more water backing up behind the sealed floodgate. The groaning sounds from the submerged infrastructure were getting louder and more frequent. Alpha 7, what's the status on that foundation failure? Marcus radioed. Getting worse, Commander. We've got 3 houses now showing structural damage and the water's still rising. I'm recommending we establish a wider evacuation perimeter. As if to punctuate the report, another loud crack echoed across the flooded neighborhood, followed by the sound of rushing water as another foundation gave way. The house, a beautiful 2-story Mediterranean style that probably cost $800,000, visibly tilted as its support structure failed. Brenda watched her neighbor's dream home slide sideways into the floodwater and finally understood the magnitude of what she had done. Oh my God, she whispered, I did this. I actually did this. The rescue operation took 4 hours to complete. By the time the last stranded resident was safely evacuated and the floodwater began to slowly recede, Riverside Meadows looked like a war zone. 5 houses had suffered foundation damage, 2 were completely uninhabitable, and the community's pristine landscaping had been replaced by a debris field of long furniture, garbage cans, and someone's destroyed Honda Civic that had been swept 3 blocks from its driveway. Marcus stood in the community center parking lot, which had become the temporary command post for the disaster response, coordinating with county emergency management officials. His Coast Guard uniform was soaked through, but he maintained the professional bearing that had guided his neighbors through the crisis. Final damage assessment shows 7 families displaced, estimated property damage in excess of $2 million, and we're still evaluating the structural integrity of the drainage system, he reported to Captain Rodriguez via satellite phone. The good news is 0 casualties thanks to the rapid response from Alpha 7 and the aircrew. Outstanding work, Commander. Your on-scene coordination probably saved lives today. Meanwhile, Brenda sat on a folding chair wrapped in a Red Cross emergency blanket, staring in shock at the devastation she had single-handedly caused. The other residents gave her a wide berth, their expressions ranging from disbelief to barely contained fury. Brenda, came a voice from behind her. She turned to see Tom Henderson, the father of the twin toddlers who had been rescued by helicopter. His face was pale with exhaustion and stress. "I want you to understand something. My children were terrified up there on that balcony. They're 2 years old and they didn't understand why the water kept rising or why helicopters were landing in their backyard." Brenda opened her mouth to respond, but Tom held up his hand. "I'm not done. We're going to lose everything. Our house, our belongings, our sense of security. The insurance company is already telling us that this was a preventable man-made disaster, which means our flood coverage might not apply." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "All because you couldn't listen to someone who actually knew what he was talking about." Mrs. Patterson, now safe but homeless, was assisted over to where Brenda sat. The elderly woman's walker squeaked on the wet asphalt as she approached. 63 years I lived in that house," she said quietly. "Raised 4 children there. Buried my husband from that living room. And now it's gone because you thought you knew better than the Coast Guard officer who was trying to prevent exactly this." One by one, the displaced families came to face Brenda, not with anger, but with something worse: disappointment and the quiet dignity of people whose lives had been unnecessarily shattered. The county emergency coordinator, a tired-looking woman named Janet Morrison, approached Marcus with a clipboard and a grim expression. "Commander Chen, we need your official statement for the incident report. The State Insurance Commission is going to want a detailed account of how this started." Marcus glanced over at Brenda, who was now surrounded by the very neighbors she had claimed to be protecting through her zealous HOA enforcement. The short version: civilian interference with critical infrastructure during a weather emergency. Despite repeated warnings from qualified personnel, Mrs. Hoffmeister manually sealed the primary drainage gate, preventing the retention system from functioning as designed. And the long version: someone who appointed herself the authority on community standards refused to listen to actual expertise and turned a manageable storm drainage situation into a multi-million-dollar disaster requiring federal emergency response assets. Janet made notes on her clipboard. "The city attorney wants to know if you'll testify about the technical aspects of what happened here." "Absolutely." 3 weeks later, Marcus was back in his dress uniform. This time he was sitting in a courtroom rather than coordinating rescues. The civil lawsuit filed by the displaced families against Brenda Hoffmeister had become the talk of the county legal system. "Commander Chen, asked the plaintiff's attorney, in your professional opinion, would this flooding have occurred if the drainage gate had remained in its normal operational position?" "No, sir. The retention pond system was designed to handle exactly this type of storm event. By sealing the primary drainage outlet, Mrs. Hoffmeister prevented the system from functioning as intended, causing catastrophic backup and overflow." "And did you attempt to warn her about the consequences of her actions?" "Multiple times. I explained that we had a major storm system approaching and that the pond needed to drain to prevent neighborhood flooding. She refused to listen and insisted on closing the gate despite having no technical knowledge of flood control systems." From the defendant's table, Brenda's lawyer tried one last desperate argument. "But, Your Honor, my client was acting in what she believed were the best interests of the community based on her understanding of HOA regulations." Judge Martinez looked over his glasses with the expression of someone who had heard enough nonsense for one lifetime. "Counselor, good intentions don't mitigate the consequences when someone ignores expert advice and causes millions of dollars in preventable damage. This court finds Mrs. Hoffmeister liable for damages resulting from her interference with critical infrastructure." The final judgment was swift and decisive. Brenda was held financially responsible for the disaster, facing lawsuits totaling $3.2 million. Her insurance company denied coverage, citing intentional acts that caused foreseeable harm. The HOA immediately removed her from the board and banned her from all community activities. But perhaps the most fitting end to the story came 6 months later, when Marcus was promoted to commander and transferred to Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, D.C. The commendation letter specifically cited his exceptional leadership during emergency response operations in civilian communities. On his last day in Riverside Meadows, Marcus walked past the retention pond, now properly maintained by actual engineers, and smiled at the small memorial plaque the neighborhood had installed. In recognition of Commander Marcus Chen, U.S. Coast Guard, whose expertise and leadership saved lives during the flood of May 26, 2025. When knowledge meets crisis, listen to those who know. And at the bottom, in smaller text that made him chuckle every time he read it: HOA Karen 0 Coast Guard 1. Brenda had moved to an apartment across town, still trying to convince anyone who would listen that she had been just following community guidelines. But in Riverside Meadows, her name had become synonymous with the importance of listening to experts, especially when they're trying to prevent your neighborhood from becoming an impromptu lake.